So I hope, as Robin has said, you've had time to print a learning journal that accompanies today's session. But if you've not, don't worry about it. Just make sure that you've got a pen and paper to hand to make some notes, and then you can print the journal later and put some reflective notes in there about the actions that you want to take. We do have the chat function enabled. I do like to interact. I'd really love to be in a room with 300 people, so let's make it feel as realistic as possible. If any questions or comments or thoughts come up for you throughout today's session, please just post them in the chat. I'm going to directly invite you to do that a number of times. And at certain points, Robin and I will have a conversation about what you are sharing. So, what are we going to be covering today? So first of all, we're going to look at, well, what is inclusive leadership? The fact that you've got, there's 300 of you that have joined and made the time today says that it's a real point of interest right now. Then we're going to look at managing versus leading. You'll all be at different stages in your career. If we think about our experiences in the last 12 to 18 months, we are all experiencing different needs and different expectations, whether that's working remotely, whether the nature of our roles has changed, or whether our responsibilities have increased or decreased. Then we're going to define what inclusion and diversity is. There's lots and lots. If you spend time on social media, particularly LinkedIn, there's a lot of content out there. And I think the most important thing that I can offer to you is that it's you personalize it and really think about what it means to you and your own experiences of inclusion and diversity. And to help you with this, I've curated for IGD what I call my flame framework. And this framework will really help you sort of take a deeper dive in what are the things that you want to do to be a more inclusive leader. Then we're going to look at how you can bring in change positively. And finally, my most favourite bit of webinars is there is space for a question and answer session at the end. And I really do encourage you to post your questions. And if you want to, when we get to this space, if there's any of you that particularly want to speak to me and actually ask your question, we can have a conversation. There will be an opportunity for you to highlight that to Robin. So, first opportunity for you to talk. So have a moment now, and if you could just jot for me into the chat function, what does inclusive leadership mean to you? So really think about what are your experiences, what are the things that you've heard, one word, two word, a phrase. If you could just post into the chat for me now, what does inclusive leadership mean to you? Robin, as and when a couple pop in, if you could just jump back on and share a few with me, that would be great.
Of course, equal opportunities for all, treating everyone the same, no favoritism. Wow, they're coming through.
I can see at the
top. How do I keep up with this? Challenge the status quo. Only because it's slowed down there. So it all seems to be coming in about being fair and treating everybody as equals.
Yeah.
As it should, really.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So hold on to some of those thoughts and let's see if we find any sort of similarities in what I'm going to share now. So there's a way of doing this quite fairly, and I always go back to the Oxford English Dictionary to help with some sort of common ground language. And it is important that you have your own view on inclusivity and how that feels for you. And later on in the session today, we're going to explore that a little bit further and personalize it for you. But ultimately, in the dictionary, it says inclusion is about aiming to include and integrate all people and groups and activities, organisations, political processes, etc., especially those that are disadvantaged, have suffered discrimination, or are living with disabilities. Their definition of a leader is the position or function of a leader or person who guides or directs a group. And I love the work that IGD have done. So there's a piece here around inclusion helping driving a community spirit and cohesion and fostering talent so that everyone can be at the best and the authentic version of themselves. The key word in there for me is this authenticity. And I want you to think about inclusion as it's not about asking people to fit in. And I've worked in corporate organizations where there's been a real distinct label about whether you are one of their people or not. And that's where inclusion doesn't work. I want you to start thinking about inclusion as how we fit together. So how do we enable everybody to have a seat at the table? So let's think in this session about how you can lead this. You can have a clear plan or strategy. However, if people don't buy into it, are inspired by it, or understand who they get to become because of it, there is a danger that it can remain a plan. So let's have a look at this table here. There's space in your journal for this, so you can follow this. And if not, just make some notes. And remember, there's going to be a recording of this session for you to review after today. So how many of you have manager in your job title? How many of you have leader in your job title? And then how many of you have neither of those things? You may be a specialist. And either of those things don't really matter, because we're all leaders of ourselves. It doesn't matter where you are in your life or your career, we still lead us. So if we look at this table here, the manager's role often is bigger and more diverse teams spread over different locations. You tend to lead rather than manage. Planning, controlling, and decision-making about customers' wants and needs is a responsibility of an empowered team. Your role is to support them, enthuse them, and to develop shared understanding of what constitutes success. So today I want to talk about how you can spend more of your time in the space of leadership, leading you in your values in an authentic way. So if we look at this table, at the top we've got vision. So managing tends to be about following and executing it, but leading is more about setting that vision. So in an inclusion space, it's about sharing stories. It's about understanding and setting the tone of how you want to allow people to fit together. At Focus, when we're managing, we're focusing on those systems and processes, but in a leadership space, we're focusing on the people. In this space of asking, the manager will ask what, and the leader will start to ask, well, why? When we're thinking about planning, a manager tends to focus on the now, whereas a leader will start to focus on the future. When we think about value, a manager tends to count value, a leader tends to create. When we think about how we appeal to others, a manager tends to appeal to the heads, the thinking, the structure, the system, whereas a leader will tend to connect with the heart. When we think about communication, a manager can be quite direct, so setting the direction and the tone, whereas the leader tends to ask more questions. When we think about our responses, our management style tends to be more reactive, so that firefighting piece, and I've worked in retail for over 20 years, so I do know what that feels like. Whereas a leader tends to be more proactively and start to ask them, well, what if? When we think, as a manager, we tend to think short term, whereas a leader tends to think long term. Now, this isn't a fixed table. I know that sounds daft because it's got a grid around the outside of it, but metaphorically, I want you to think about these two styles in the left-hand column and the right-hand column as a range, okay? So if we think about, if you've ever done a psychometric or you've done any reading around this, if you think about introversion and extroversion, we have both of those things at play at all times. We have a preference of where we like to spend more time, but that range will shift depending on the environment that we're in. So for an example, for me, I have a natural preference towards extroversion. I love being around other people. I love socializing. And obviously in the last 12 to 18 months, the ability to do that just hasn't been available to me. But actually, because I've moved further down the other end of my scale in introversion and spending more time on myself, some more reflective practice, I've actually managed to unlock a bit of creativity in my mindset, and it's allowed me to write some really great material. I've been able to connect with new clients, new customers, and that's been able because I've shifted away from my natural preference. So I'd like you to think about the two ranges here as being on a scale. So sometimes you will lead to more following and executing, and other times you will be in the space of setting the vision. The important thing is, where are you right now? Think about it as a scale for you right now. Where are you right now? What do you tend to do? Where are you spending the most of your time? And what could you be doing in order to spend more time in this leadership space when we think about inclusion? The next thing is to really think about, well, where is your need stemming from? 300 of you have joined this webinar today. I'm really grateful for that, as our IGD. But ask yourself, well, why are you here today? And what is the expectation on you or for you about your space and inclusion? In the research that I've done in this space, there are 5 distinct reasons around why people are leaning into inclusivity and diversion. And that is, the first one is they're told to. There's a sense of feeling behind. Certainly with the increase in focus in the Black Lives Matter movement last year, there was a real surge in demand to explore this space a lot more. There's a need to, there's a compliance issue. There's a thing that we need to keep up with. There is a standard that we need to adhere to. The next one is we've got to, there's a hygiene factor or competition. Your future talent is coming through the doors and they're expecting a certain tone around inclusion and diversity that they're not quite experiencing. So we've got to get better at this. The next one is that we have to. There's a moral and social need within your organization or for yourself to bring this to the forefront. And the last one is that you want to, you know it's important to your success. So we're going to run a little poll. So we won't know who, but we will know that you've submitted. We're going to run a poll now with these 5 areas. And what we'd like you to do is be really honest and just say, where are you now with this? What are your motivations? Okay, that is incredible. So pretty much 87% of you have voted. I mean, that is really heartwarming. And for the fact that there's such a high percentage of you that want to, you know it's the right thing to do. But the honesty in the fact that you are, you know, early on that journey, you're early on the journey with how you bring in this inclusion. And are you leading it, if we think about the previous table, or are you managing it in a reactive space because it's this focus area has been put on to you? Or do you genuinely feel a little bit behind? Do you genuinely feel that you've got the thought about it, but you're not quite sure where to take it next? And I'm hoping today I can help you with that. Interestingly, at IGD, they've obviously done an awful lot of research with your companies and companies that aren't in the webinar today. And that's tend to have shown that most people want to or have to, there's a natural curiosity to support and influence change from a younger audience. And if you think about the programs that are on offer here, we talk about graduates, apprenticeships and interns on Fast Track. And then the next one, which we can see here, is a bit of got to, have to, from those who have been in the industry for longer and recognise the need for change. You've probably heard it talked about and might have been involved in initiatives, but perhaps are feeling a little less confident in knowing how to make an impact. And we are right. I mean, this is great stuff around this 82% wanting to. And for those of you that are really early in the journey, keep going and think about what I share with you today to help you start to progress in that space. I said earlier that I work quite closely with the BRC and they're also quite focused on inclusion and diversity. And they recently did a set of surveys in conjunction with Manchester Business School and PricewaterhouseCoopers. And this is really interesting because it's within the pool that you work in. So these are all retailers. And it showed that 69% of retail businesses still had an all-male chair, CEO or CFO in the business. 81% still had all-white board members. 32% did not have an LGBTQ plus policy in their HR guidelines. Only 7% could identify a disabled leader in the organisation. However, 32% saw remote working as an opportunity for having a more diverse population due to the availability of being able to recruit from further afield. So the role that you play as an inclusive leader is integral to this tide shifting. You are creating the workforce of the future. So what I want to offer to you is what I've designed is called the Flame Framework. So there's a quote here by Heather Ashamara around allowing the fires of transformation to burn away all that doesn't serve you. And I want to share an example with you. So I don't know about the rest of you, but in the last 12 to 18 months, I think I've pretty much watched the whole of Netflix. I think I've done the whole of the Apple TV and I'm pretty much finished Sky. But there's one program that I found that is now becoming a bit of a guilty pleasure and I'm having to sort of wean myself off. And it's a program on the Food Network called The Pioneer Woman. And the pioneer woman, she lives on a ranch in Oklahoma. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And her husband obviously is a cowboy, and he has a team of other cowboys and cowgirls that he works with. And the story is that she's inside making rib sticking food, and they're out, and you get pictures outside where they're doing stuff on the ranch. And the food that she eats is just outrageously calorific, and I just sit there dribbling while eating a carrot stick. However, there was one episode where the cowboys were out on the ranch, and what they were doing is they were setting fire to the field that the cattle had been grazing in. And it's like, what are you doing? That's so counterintuitive. If you think about the examples we've had here of, peat bogs burning, etc., you're like, oh God, that can't be a good thing. Don't set fire to things. But the reality is, the reason they were setting fire to it is they needed to burn away all of the old stuff in order to allow those green shoots to come through, to allow the fresh grass to come through for the next season, so that the cattle could graze on good, nutritious grass. And I want you to think about that when you approach what you want to be able to do with inclusion. What are the things that you need to burn away, to get rid of, in order to let those green shoots come through? So the first is, the F is foreground. So what is the inclusive environment that you create? What are the bias stories at play? Now, if you're interested more in unconscious bias, I did do a session for IGD earlier in the year, and you'll be able to look at that on the platform. So please go and have a look at that if you want to hear more about unconscious bias. Psychological safety is a belief that no one will be punished or humiliated for speaking up with their ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And that is a quote by a lady called Amy Edmondson, who was a Harvard Business School professor. So think about it. What are your experiences of psychological safety? Do you feel safe to speak out? Do you feel safe in knowing what you need to be saying and when you need to say it? Or is this just about having an open and honest conversation? And do other people feel the same thing? Amy Edmondson shared that teams which made more mistakes were actually more successful than others. Why? Because creating an environment in which people feel comfortable to take risks is key to fostering innovation in the workplace. So there are many models for effective teams, Belbin, Tuckman, for example, and these models are all partly true and all partly flawed. However, they are all helpful. So I do suggest that you go and spend some time looking at team models. And there are some similarities that run throughout all of these models. And fundamentally, that is psychological safety. It's about creating a space where someone can fully turn up in their team. You can bring real accountability and healthy challenge. You can have real commitment and attention to results. So just as one of you have just shared with us, you've been in a meeting and you've not been asked to contribute. There's been no space for you to raise your voice, or because you feel differented, you don't think you should speak up. There's a lack of confidence in the room. A solid team should be able to bounce ideas off each other, strengthen action plans, and help solve issues and provide support to each other. Amy Edmondson has delivered a great TED talk called Psychological Safety in the Workplace. And I really suggest you go and listen to that to hear more about how you can bring that to life. But create a great environment so that everyone can be at the best. And if you actively support change, change will come. It is not the time now, if you're heavily into bringing inclusion into your leadership style, to try and keep things as normal. And I'm not going to go to a normalcy bias rant, but I will say that you can't solve a problem with the thinking that created it. So it is time to start thinking about things differently. Which leads me to listen and hear. Dial down your own bias stories, dial down what it means to you, and start listening to what the person is actually saying. Encourage a no blame culture. There's a lot of education at play here in what is okay and what is not okay. And encourage an open forum to share experiences. Think how simple those 2 questions were that I shared with you earlier, and how easily you access the responses to it. There is no problem with asking those questions to the people in your teams, the people in your peer groups, or indeed your social network outside of that. Misunderstandings often arise because of the fear of consequences. Subsequently, the situation deteriorates into a major incident, which could have been avoided with more honesty and openness. Encourage staff to admit their biases. As I say, we had the unconscious bias webinar early in the year, and there was a lot of honesty in there about people who genuinely didn't realise that the stories that they created in their heads and the things that had made true to themselves actually fell outside what inclusivity is about and was actively excluding them for being part of what they wanted to be part of. The next one is be ambitious. Goodness me. Whilst ambition is really important, I'm not saying change everything overnight, but start to think about what are those incremental changes that you can make in order to bring this to life. So think about not only right now, but think about the future. What could you be doing right now that will create an inclusive and diverse future that you want? Create or be involved in recruitment streams, understand what that looks like within your businesses, start to bring together think tanks and project teams where there's cognitive diversity at play, so you can really understand what differences people are feeling. There is a need for a strong vision and a set of values to hold the organisation together and provide clear guidelines for empowered employees. So what are the values of your company and where do they sit in the space of inclusion? These values in companies normally include caring for customers. Employees are often exemplified by improvement with the physical working conditions and increased opportunities for personal development. It should connect with people. Wherever you're speaking about inclusion, it is not necessarily just about a tick box exercise of ensuring that you have enough of the right people in the right spaces. It should be about authentically being inclusive. The next one is mean it. Mean it. I really loved the way that you responded to the poll earlier. There is a lot of energy in here to bring this to life, so mean it. Metrics are a great marker for success, but don't allow your intentions to get lost in the tick box exercise. Think about the stories that you are building by being more inclusive. Those stories are far more powerful to new people coming into your business and your customers than having a certain percentage in a certain space. So if I was to join your organisation, how would I experience your I&D culture? What stories would I hear? What are the things that I would see? Are people inspired by the culture? Be honest with yourself and be open to change. Trust everyone as an individual. Their job title or psychometric does not define who they are. Hold yourself and others to account when biases are at play. And make it part of your one-to-ones, your coffee chats, your business as usual conversations. And as you start to learn more about the teams that you've been in, the aspirations and their experiences that they've had, is there a set of ground rules that you can create and hold true when you're connecting? And lastly, education. What do you need to know more about? Build awareness in your teams. Think about their own biases and the visions for the future. You may have a set of organisational behaviours that you can align to, but it's always worth opening a conversation with the team and share personal experiences just as you had with me today and agreeing a set of team behaviours of how you will keep each other to account. These should be points of celebration rather than a set of rules. So before we move into a space when we can start to connect with each other, I just want to think about help you with how do you bring in change. So a lot of people say, well, I know what I want and I've done all of this work, but how do I get it over the line? How do I get people to hear me? Well, there's a model here that I want to share with you and it's in your journals. So the first thing to think about is the culture of your business. So what initiatives are important and what are the desired outcomes for inclusion and diversity in your space? The second one is, what are those individual behaviours? What mindsets and practices will distinguish your inclusivity and your intent? Are people invested in that intention? Are they excited by it? Are they clear about what's in it for them and who it allows them to become? And the next one is those internal practices. So what policies and vehicles are available to really bring this to life for you? Is it on the organisation team's agenda? Is it part of the strategy? How can you empower others to deliver the agenda? And if your organisation is at the start of the journey, what can you do with your own team to start this now? So we've covered a lot of ground there, which is why Robin and I have chosen to give a bit of space over to question and answers. So as I said earlier in the session, you post your questions in the chat. If you want to come on the mic and talk to me, that would be amazing. If not, Robin, you can share the question with me and a name if that's okay. It's always nice talking to a person and I can respond to the best of my ability to support.
Great. I think that will work nicely. Okay, let's get some questions through. So if you do have a question for Sam, we're going to spend the next 10-15 minutes answering those questions. And obviously, if you do have any further questions afterwards, just keep the questions coming in and then I'll forward that over to Sam afterwards. So if you do have anything, oh, hang on. We have, okay, I have Dan Patmore has a question to ask. Okay, Dan, you can unmute yourself now.
Lovely, thank you, and thanks for taking us through that, Sam. I think my question is that broader challenge. If you think about your Venn diagram on the previous slide, which is the organisation I work in is talking a good game around inclusion. There's a lot of there are networks in place to champion different areas where inclusivity would be needed, whether that's around gender balance, carers, LGBTQ communities, race inclusion, all that sort of thing. So that at very highest levels of the business, there's certainly some good ambition. What I'm struggling with as I'm trying to get involved with it is how to really meaningfully make a difference and move that conversation on from well-meaning groups of people talking about the need for change. And if I think particularly there are a couple of colleagues who have been more than open with sharing their experiences coming with different race backgrounds. And what I'm getting more and more conscious of is that for our, should we say, more diverse colleagues, that we keep boiling them down to what their point of difference is. And it's frustrating me that these are talented people that we're coming to work and then talking about their race. And I guess, sorry, I'm rambling now, but I guess where I'm kind of at is it's that moving, that inertia. There's definitely an overall willingness, but then really starting to implement practices that genuinely make a difference is where I sometimes get a bit lost.
Okay, it's really good. And there's a really great book that I recommend if you want to spend a weekend just losing yourself in something. And it's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And it really lays out quite honestly where those blocks are. So you've just really eloquently explained those blocks in making this a real living thing. And also, I would hope in a number of years' time we're at an unconscious competence layer with this, that it's the thing that we do, rather than, as you say, by trying to do this work, what we're actually doing is highlighting the people we're meant to be making feel more included. So they're still on the outside, even though the intention is the opposite. And I do understand that. I think it's a bit like I said before, we can't solve the problem with the thinking that created the problem in the first place. So what we tend to do, and I've worked in a people team for 20 years in my career, so I know a natural thing is to put a strategy in place, as I said earlier, some metrics in place about what great looks like, etc. Then it has to go through all the different layers of the business to actually influence the people that it's actually probably going to benefit the most. So I like to work the other way around. So when I work with organizations, what I tend to do is start with the people that are probably in a higher proportion than the smaller number that sit at the top. And I like to, and it's a bit like the listening piece, is really hear those stories about how they're feeling, because what we tend to do when I'm a white woman, I've struggled sometimes to pick up inclusion work because I'm worried whether I'm representative. However, doing nothing is not an option for me. So I step into this space to support. So I really believe that the biggest wave of change you can bring in is by creating conversations with people when there is a wider population of people, and creating those stories and aspirations and what they want. Because what we tend to do is when we're trying to help out is we imagine what's best. The only people that really know what's best for them and how they want to be and how they want to experience being true to their difference, not about all becoming together as one, but being true to their difference authentically, but being part of the big picture, are the individuals. So, Dan, if you unmute yourself a sec, I just would like to interact, if that's okay. Hiya. So, what conversations are at play with the audience that you are trying to positively influence? What is going on there at the moment?
And I think that's a great point. I think it's uneven.
Yeah.
I think certainly when a couple of the colleagues that I've spoken to, you know, they are keen to engage, but actually one of them has made a really good point, which is, well, I'm happy to engage in this next wave of trying to do something about it, as long as it achieves something, as long as it actually goes somewhere. And I think a frustration with the sort of the committee style inertia. That's certainly a conversation that's come up with a couple of people I've spoken to. We have been exploring whether we can have regular, I guess it's essentially a regular listening group with various members of the leadership team to hear firsthand the experiences colleagues are having. It's got a mixed level of feedback from people we've polled around whether they'd find it useful or not, as well as people's well-meaning sense of trying to get it all right, so not offending anyone along the way. And I think that obviously is part of the challenge I have with the committee culture of a large traditional business, where I guess people aren't willing to make positive mistakes in this, you know, sort of a failing fast thing.
Yeah, and so how can you encourage authenticity in others if you're not being authentically honest yourself?
Yeah.
And I think there's something in there about listening groups are great, you know, and I run some myself. But unless people are clear about why they're in there, what's the point? You know, if there isn't a clear vision, and that from a senior voice, I don't want to get this wrong, therefore I do not know what to say right now, that's when change starts to come. I work with senior leaders. I'm working with a couple of CEOs at the moment who are genuinely frightened of getting this wrong, and because they're genuinely frightened, they're just not saying anything. And they are pushing it on their HR teams to make a difference. That's not how difference is going to be brought in. So I do understand about the committee culture. Again, it comes back to this old way of thinking about things, doesn't it? And old vehicles no longer being fit for use. You know, it's like me trying to drive around in drive up to my mum's in York in a 2CV from the 70s and not, being surprised it breaks down. You know, there is times to refresh certain things. But I'm wondering whether those listening groups are diverse in themselves. So it is a mixture of those people. So there are really great ground rules at the beginning. And I'm conscious that I'm obviously really passionate, as you are, about this stuff, and we could get a coffee and keep talking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But Dan, link me in later, and I can deeper dive with you on a few things. But I do think there's something in there about role modeling what you're trying to achieve. So if you have those listening groups, keep them nice and small so that everybody feels connected, but also have a mixture of layers of your organization. If you can achieve that with some really great ground rules and honesty and openness at the beginning, like those 2 questions I asked you before, that's where change will start to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate that.
You are more than welcome, Dan. Thank you for jumping on as well.
No worries.
Thank you, Dan. And I hope that helped answer other people's questions as well. Probably got time for a couple more questions. Now, this one comes from Sam at KP Snacks. How do we best prepare a workforce for changes to make us fully inclusive?
Wow. I think there's elements in what I've just shared with Dan. So there is a model by Blanchard called Situational Leadership, and it talks about how to help people move through change. Again, Sam, if you want to link up with me later, I can direct you to some reading on that. But what it shows is that at the beginning of a change journey, see that it's a 4-box model, and you can sit the change curve on top of it. So where at the start of the change curve, where people are in shock, denial, anger, unclear, insecure, etc., it shows you the steps to take to help people feel psychologically safe with what's happening. However, I go back to what I shared with Dan. leadership. So if I was walking down the street and somebody walked past me, and I want you to drop COVID guidelines to start with, I just want you to keep the metaphor going. And I was walking down the street and somebody grabbed me by the wrist and started to walk with me up the street. My natural reaction is going to be to dig my heels in and push back, because I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where you're taking me. I don't know why we're going there. And, you know, I was just out to get myself a paper and a pint of milk and I was going home. You're changing my agenda. You're changing where my focus was. However, if somebody walks alongside you and sort of says, where are you off to? And I don't mean this in a creepy way, but where are you off to? Where are you going? Are you getting blah, 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 blah. You feel more comfortable because you're still in control and you know your why. I tend to find the reason this doesn't work is at a senior level, a decision is made and everybody feels like they've been grabbed by the wrist and they're being dragged along on a journey. The key is making people feel that that journey is one that they're choosing to go on. So I would suggest before launch, you do a lot of, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical talking groups, get some research in, make sure it's lovely and confidential and psychologically safe, but get some questionnaires out there, get some data, really understand what positive change means to them. And then when you go to launch, you can say, you asked for this, and we are going to bring in this, and we're going to ask you for feedback about it in 3 months' time. We want to make sure we get this right. So the agenda has been created by the individuals. You really want to benefit from it. Hope that's okay. Again, if you want to know any more outside of this, just please link in with me and we can have another chat. I think we've got time, maybe one more, Robin.
Yeah, I think we can do one quick one. Okay, so this one comes from Dorota Duncan, I believe. Do you have any suggestions if someone in our team feels they are not included, but they don't want to cooperate with the rest of the team?
So the first question, if we were in a coaching session, is that always? Is it that they always? So we talked about ranges earlier in that leadership model. Is it one end is always and one end is never? So where are they on that scale? And what is the situation, or what is happening in the system at that point, the environment is a better word, where they won't join in? And at the point that they won't connect in with the team, it's probably a fear-based thought, or I'm not sure, it's very difficult when we're not chatting. What I would suggest you do is start off with, I have noticed, and I'm curious about how you are feeling right now, and let them talk. Because it won't be always and it won't be never. They are on one of those sliding scales. And your role, because you've asked the question, you obviously care about it, is to show that with compassion. The key to most blocks in leadership and people is to offer compassion, when deep down, the only thing we want to do is sort yourself out, or stop doing that, or you're just creating more work for me, is to step out of that and just say, how are you feeling right now? What's working, what's not working? And just listen. Just listen. I think we spend a lot of time as leaders and managers and carers of others trying to problem solve for them. The solutions to everybody's behaviours, habits, attitudes is within them. Your role really is just to give them the space to be able to get it off their chest, and then you know what you're dealing with. Again, any other advice, link me in afterwards and I'm happy to talk further. Okay, Robin.
Okay, so there are more questions in there, so please don't worry if your question hasn't been answered. We're just a bit pressed for time, but as I said, I will be passing these over to Sam afterwards. She can pick up with you later.
Yeah, brilliant. And those questions won't go to waste. So I am doing 2 follow-up podcasts for IGD following from today, and your questions will really help us decide what are the topics we're going to cover. So please do not think I won't answer your question. I will, but we will do it in a slightly different way. So, and I just want to say a huge thank you for being so honest and open with the questions that you've got. So what have we looked at? So we've looked at what inclusive leadership is. We've looked at the managing versus leading spectrum. We've looked at defining inclusion and diversity. We've looked at the flame framework, and we've looked at bringing in change. IGD have done, as I said, so much work in this space. They've got some amazing top tips. These are in your learning journal for you to look at. My top tip is to use that flame framework as a discussion point to start with your teams, and start to see how they're feeling, what their thoughts are, and what their ideas are. And for you, what I would really love you to think about is, what will you do differently after what you've heard today? And who can I ask in my business for more information?